Can you imagine a time when the cavalry, the once feared mounted force, was laughed at and dismissed as obsolete? For centuries, cavalry was the backbone of armies, but with the advent of machine guns and modern warfare, it seemed their time had come and gone. Yet, in a dramatic turn of events, this so-called outdated force became a nightmare for the very machine guns that were supposed to end them. At the dawn of the 20th century, the cavalry was in a precarious position. The rise of industrial warfare, with its deadly precision and the sheer firepower of machine guns, had left many wondering if mounted soldiers could still have a place on the battlefield. The machine gun was the ultimate weapon, mowing down infantry and cavalry alike. It seemed like a new era had arrived, one that left no room for the traditional horse-mounted warriors. But the cavalry wasn't going down without a fight. They adapted, they learned, and in the most unexpected twist, they became one of the most formidable threats to the entrenched machine gunners. In the early stages of World War I, the cavalry was still being sent into battle with the belief that their speed and agility would give them an edge. But against the backdrop of trench warfare and machine gun fire, the cavalry charge seemed like a relic of the past. Soldiers in the trenches, armed with rapid-fire weapons, could cut down mounted troops in seconds. The battlefield had become a place where speed was no longer the key to victory. It was firepower. Yet, the cavalry had something the machine guns couldn't account for: mobility. While machine gunners were locked into defensive positions, cavalry units were still able to maneuver, retreat, and strike at vulnerable points. They could move in ways that infantry and even tanks couldn't replicate. The cavalry had the advantage of surprise, and soon they would find a way to turn that into their greatest strength. One such unit, the British cavalry, faced this very dilemma. The early days of the war saw them charging across no man's land, only to be mowed down by withering machine gun fire. But instead of retreating, they adapted. The cavalry stopped charging blindly into machine gun fire and began using their mobility to hit the Germans where they least expected it. They would move at night, using the cover of darkness to approach machine gun positions. And when the moment came, they would strike with precision and speed. The cavalry was no longer just a blunt instrument. It had become a weapon of fear and surprise. As the cavalry learned how to operate in this new world of modern warfare, their role began to evolve. They were no longer the sweeping charges of the past. Instead, they became a force that could maneuver quickly, find gaps in the enemy lines, and strike with devastating impact. The machine guns, which were thought to be the perfect defense, suddenly found themselves facing an opponent they had never anticipated. The cavalry that could think, adapt, and move like no other force on the battlefield. This unexpected power shift didn't just change the battlefield tactics. It changed the very nature of warfare itself. As the cavalry embraced new methods of fighting, they turned the tide of battles in ways no one thought possible. The cavalry, once ridiculed, had become the ultimate nightmare of the machine guns. Want to know how this transformation from mockery to terror came to be? Leave a like, comment, and subscribe to hear the rest of this story. The machine gun was hailed as the weapon that would change warfare forever. As the world entered the 20th century, no one could deny the terrifying efficiency of these rapid-fire weapons. They were the centerpiece of modern armies, designed to eliminate infantry and cavalry with brutal efficiency. The age of the cavalry, once synonymous with speed and glory, seemed like a relic of a bygone era. Machine guns were designed for one purpose: to dominate the battlefield. The rapid-fire capabilities of these weapons could decimate anything in their path. A cavalry charge, once a symbol of power, now seemed like an invitation to death. Soldiers in the trenches, armed with machine guns, could mow down entire units of cavalry in a matter of seconds. It was a new, cold, mechanized reality where the horse and rider had no place. But, surprisingly, the cavalry did not fade away. So, the cavalry soldiers, trained in the art of warfare and steeped in tradition, didn't just accept their fate. They looked at the machine guns and saw something that the machine gun crews overlooked: an opportunity. It wasn't about matching firepower with firepower. It was about learning to use the advantages they still had, namely speed, maneuverability, and the element of surprise. The British cavalry, for example, did not simply charge at the enemy head-on, as they had done in the past. Instead, they began to experiment with more creative tactics rather than charging. Into the open, they used their speed to maneuver around the enemy, always staying out of the line of fire. The machine guns, designed to shoot in a fixed direction, were not equipped to handle the cavalry's unpredictable movements. In fact, the cavalry began to use the very thing that was supposed to make them obsolete machine gun fire to their advantage. They would draw the fire of the machine guns, causing the enemy to waste ammunition and then retreat quickly, only to return with a devastating strike when the time was right. The machine guns were not invisible. They had their limitations. While they could wipe out infantry or cavalry charging in a straight line, they could not react fast enough to the cavalry's ability to adapt, move, and strike from unexpected angles. In the thick of the trenches, the cavalry started using their mobility to scout out positions, identify weaknesses in the enemy lines, and pick off vulnerable machine gun units one by one. Instead of facing a direct confrontation, they used their speed to disrupt the machine gunners, forcing them into a defensive position, often before the enemy even realized what was happening. One of the key elements that the cavalry employed was night operations. The machine guns had been built for dominance during the daylight hours, but the cavalry began to use darkness to their advantage. At night, the cavalry could move swiftly, silently, and without the threat of the machine guns' overwhelming firepower. With new stealth tactics, they attacked machine gun positions under the cover of darkness, creating chaos in the enemy's ranks. It was a game of cat and mouse, except the cavalry was no longer the hunted. They were now the hunters. This shift in tactics proved incredibly effective. The machine guns, once seen as the unstoppable force of the battlefield, were beginning to falter. They were powerful, yes, but they were also limited by their positioning, their vulnerability to surprise, and their inability to handle the fluid, unpredictable nature of cavalry warfare. The cavalry, with their adaptability, had turned the tables. As the cavalry learned how to survive in this new world of mechanized warfare, they also became a symbol of how old-school strategies could still work when applied with creativity. They had figured out how to beat the unbeatable. The cavalry had proven that it wasn't just about the firepower. It was about how you used the terrain, the time, and the tools at your disposal. The war had been long, brutal, and relentless. It seemed like every battle ended in tragedy, with both sides suffering losses that seemed insurmountable. The cavalry had already faced ridicule as they charged at machine gun nests, only to be cut down mercilessly. But in one particular battle, when all hope seemed lost, an unlikely hero rose from the ashes of what seemed to be an inevitable defeat. This hero wasn't a general, nor was he a celebrated figure on the battlefield. It was an ordinary cavalry officer who, with no choice but to adapt, led his men in a way no one had ever anticipated. It all started with an attack that went terribly wrong. The cavalry, confident in their ability to outmaneuver the enemy, had charged head-on into a fortified position. The machine guns tore into the horses and riders alike, creating a scene of unimaginable carnage. It seemed like the cavalry had been wiped off the battlefield, their once mighty presence reduced to nothing but a memory. The enemy forces had almost broken through their lines, and defeat seemed imminent. But then, in the midst of the chaos, a cavalry officer, one who had been mocked for his unconventional ideas, stepped forward with a daring new plan. The officer had been studying the battle for hours, observing how the machine guns operated, how they shifted positions, and where their blind spots were. He wasn't a military genius in the traditional sense, but he understood something that many of his peers didn't. The key to defeating the machine guns wasn't to face them head-on. It was to outsmart them, to force them into a position where they couldn't shoot effectively. With a bold sense of purpose, the officer ordered his cavalrymen to scatter in different directions, but at a controlled, synchronized pace. This wasn't a retreat, it was a calculated maneuver. The cavalry split up into smaller, faster units that moved unpredictably across the battlefield, keeping the machine gun positions in a constant state of confusion. The officer had noticed that the machine gunners relied on their ability to focus on a single target at a time. So, by scattering his forces, he ensured that the gunners couldn't track them all at once. As the cavalry spread out, they began to target the machine gun positions from unexpected angles, attacking them when the gunners least expected it. They moved so quickly that the enemy couldn't readjust their fire in time. The element of surprise was no longer on the side of the machine gunners. It was with the cavalry. For the first time in days, the machine guns were forced to retreat. The cavalry, once thought to be obsolete, was now wreaking havoc on the very weapons that had been used to mock them. The officer's strategy had not only saved the remnants of his army, but it had also turned the tide of the battle. The machine gunners, overwhelmed by the unexpected shift in tactics, were now in a position where they couldn't effectively defend themselves. The cavalry had become a nightmare for the machine guns. The officer, despite the heavy losses sustained in the earlier charges, had managed to achieve something unimaginable. His unconventional tactics, though ridiculed by his peers, had worked. The battle, which had seemed like a lost cause just hours before, was now turning into a victory. His men rallied behind him, their confidence renewed by the unexpected success of his strategy. This was the moment that changed everything for the cavalry. What had once been seen as a symbol of outdated warfare was now proving to be a vital force on the modern battlefield. It wasn't the strength of their horses or the speed of their charges that made them effective. It was their ability to adapt, to outthink their enemies, and to strike where they were least expected. In this battle, the cavalry had found a new purpose, not as a relic of the past, but as a force that could overcome even the most devastating technological advancements. The machine guns had been a dominant force on the battlefield, but in the end, it wasn't technology that won the day. It was the ingenuity and bravery of a single officer and his men. Their victory was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost. The cavalry had always been synonymous with speed, but in the age of machine guns, speed alone wasn't enough. The once feared horse-mounted soldiers now found themselves facing a weapon that could wipe them out in an instant. The machine gun, the rapid-fire weapons, could mow down a cavalry charge with ruthless efficiency, and for a while, it seemed like the horse would be relegated to the pages of history. But there was something the cavalry had that the machine gun didn't: unpredictability. And that very unpredictability would become the cavalry's greatest weapon. As the war dragged on, the cavalry adapted to the new reality of modern warfare. No longer did they charge headlong into machine gun fire. Instead, they embraced a new strategy, one that would defy everything the enemy thought they knew about cavalry tactics. They began to use the terrain to their advantage, moving silently through forests, using the cover of night, and attacking from unexpected angles. The machine guns, designed to decimate predictable infantry formations, couldn't handle the cavalry's ability to move quickly, to change direction without warning, to strike without being seen coming. In one particularly dramatic encounter, a cavalry unit was tasked with clearing a series of machine gun positions entrenched along a ridge. The enemy was dug in, their machine guns pointed toward the only visible route for attack. It seemed like a suicide mission, an army of mounted soldiers charging directly into a line of heavy fire. The machine gunners were confident that this would be just another easy victory. But the cavalry commander had a different plan. Instead of charging straight into the fire, the cavalry commander split his forces, sending smaller groups to move around the enemy's flanks and attack from multiple directions. He had realized something crucial: the machine guns were designed to shoot directly ahead, but they had limited ability to track targets that were moving quickly in different directions. With speed and agility on their side, the cavalry could overwhelm the machine gunners with sheer unpredictability. The cavalry units, now scattered in different positions, moved like ghosts across the battlefield. They kept the machine gunners guessing, attacking at unexpected intervals and retreating before the enemy could respond effectively. The machine gunners, trained to focus on one target at a time, found themselves unable to adjust quickly enough to the constantly shifting positions of the cavalry. The confusion was enough to break their lines. The cavalry's new strategy wasn't just about speed, it was about timing, about knowing when to attack and when to retreat. It was about using the landscape, the cover of night, and the unpredictable nature of their movements to disorient and confuse the enemy. The machine guns, once thought to be the ultimate force on the battlefield, were no match for the cavalry's ability to outmaneuver them. This new strategy didn't just win battles, it changed the way the cavalry was viewed by both their enemies and their own commanders. No longer were they considered an outdated force. They had adapted, and in doing so, they had proven that, with the right strategy, the cavalry could still be a terrifying force on the modern battlefield. By outsmarting the machine guns, the cavalry had done something remarkable. They had reclaimed their place in the war. The cavalry's ability to adapt, to outthink their enemy, and to strike with unpredictable speed and precision had turned the tide in battle after battle. The machine guns, once the undisputed rulers of the battlefield, had met their match in the most unexpected of places. On horseback, the cavalry had been underestimating the power of machine guns for years, but as the war dragged on, they finally found their moment to strike back. The machine guns, which had once seemed unbeatable, were about to meet their match. In a dramatic turn of events, a well-timed cavalry charge would disrupt the enemy's entire strategy, completely shifting the momentum of the battle. The stage was set in a dense, foggy, valley-perfect terrain for surprise maneuvers. The enemy had fortified a ridge, using their machine guns to create an impenetrable defense. For weeks, they had held their ground, pushing back any attempts at assault. The cavalry, once known for their bravery but mocked for their seeming inadequacy in the face of modern weapons, had been ordered to break the stalemate. But the cavalry had learned. They knew the machine gunners were counting on them to attack head-on, charging blindly into their crosshairs. They'd seen it time and time again, the futile cavalry charges that led only to death. This time, however, they had a different plan. Instead of charging down the narrow valley where the machine guns had the perfect line of fire, They used the terrain to their advantage. The cavalry moved silently under the cover of trees and fog, flanking the enemy positions from the side, at the moment when the enemy was most confident. When they thought they had the cavalry right where they wanted them, the sound of thundering hooves shattered the stillness of the fog. The cavalry had moved fast, and they had moved smart. They had positioned themselves out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The machine gunners, confident in their positions, opened fire, but they were firing at nothing. The cavalry had already moved. In a stunning reversal, the cavalry charged from multiple directions, hitting the machine gun positions from unexpected angles. The enemy, caught completely off guard, scrambled to adjust their fire, but it was too late. The cavalry, now a well-coordinated and agile force, swarmed over the machine gunners, forcing them into retreat. It wasn't just about speed, it was about timing and surprise. The cavalry charged with precision, knowing exactly when to hit and where to strike. They didn't waste time or energy charging blindly into a hail of bullets. Instead, they attacked with calculated force, overwhelming the machine gun positions before the enemy could respond. The result was nothing short of breathtaking, a victory for the cavalry, and a crushing blow to the machine guns that had once been seen as the ultimate weapon. This wasn't just a charge. It was a symbol of the cavalry's ability to adapt and evolve. The machine guns had ruled the battlefield for so long, and yet here were the cavalry, those same men who had been laughed at and ridiculed, turning the tables with an audacious strategy that no one had expected. They had outsmarted their enemy at their own game. The charge wasn't about brute force. It was about using intelligence and agility to beat the odds. As the dust settled and the enemy forces regrouped, they couldn't help but wonder how they had been so easily. They had been prepared for a traditional cavalry charge, but instead they had faced a new kind of warfare. The cavalry had found a way to turn their most significant weakness into their greatest strength, their mobility. This charge didn't just change the course of a single battle, it fundamentally altered how the cavalry was perceived. They were no longer just a symbol of the past, but a force to be reckoned with on the modern battlefield. The machine guns, for the first time, had met their match in the most unexpected of places. The cavalry that had once been laughed at. For years, the machine guns had been the undisputed rulers of the battlefield, their rapid-fire power making them a force to be reckoned with. Their job was simple: mow down any enemy that dared to cross their line of fire. Cavalrymen, once seen as an elite force on horseback, were now reduced to mere targets, easy prey for the relentless machine guns. But what the machine gunners didn't realize was that they were facing an enemy who would soon become their worst nightmare. It all started with the cavalry's newfound strategy, one that relied on surprise, mobility, and unpredictability. For too long, they had been charging directly into machine gun fire, only to be torn apart. But now they were learning to outwit their adversaries. Instead of attacking head-on, they began to strike from unexpected angles, using the cover of night and terrain to their advantage. Their movements were fast, fluid, and nearly impossible to predict. The machine gunners, however, weren't accustomed to facing such an elusive opponent. They were trained to set up their positions, fixate on one target, and open fire. It was a straightforward tactic, one that had worked for years. But the cavalry was now moving so fast, so unpredictably, that the machine gunners found themselves powerless. Each time they thought they had a clear shot, the cavalry had already vanished, only to appear somewhere else. The machine guns, once seen as the ultimate weapon, were no longer the threat. The cavalry had become the real terror. The enemy machine gun crews, who had once dismissed the cavalry as a relic of the past, now found themselves in a nightmare scenario. The cavalry was everywhere, and nowhere at all. At once, the speed of their movements made it impossible to track them, and their unpredictability was wearing down the machine gunners' resolve. The once confident soldiers who had mocked the cavalry for being outdated and useless now realized they were facing a force they couldn't control. One particularly tense battle exemplified this shift in power. The cavalry, using their new tactics, surrounded a heavily fortified position guarded by several machine gun nests. The machine gunners, confident in their positions, opened fire, expecting the cavalry to charge directly into their line of sight. But instead, the cavalry rode swiftly around the perimeter, launching hit-and-run attacks, throwing the machine gun crews into a state of disarray. They were forced to retreat, unable to adapt to the cavalry's rapid, unpredictable movements. As the cavalry regrouped after their successful strike, they could feel the change in the air. They were no longer seen as a laughingstock, were a legitimate threat, one that could outmaneuver the very weapons that had once been thought unbeatable. The machine gunners, who had once been the epitome of modern warfare, now feared the cavalry more than they feared anything else on the battlefield. For the first time, the tables had turned. The cavalry had turned their greatest disadvantage, being outmatched by technology, into their most powerful weapon. They had shown the world that speed, adaptability, and the element of surprise were just as lethal as firepower. The machine guns had been the symbol of warfare for so long, but the cavalry's innovation had shattered that illusion. The cavalry was no longer a relic of the past. It was the future of warfare. The once mocked cavalry had become the worst nightmare of the machine gunners. They had proven that there was always room for innovation, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The cavalry's ability to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies had not only changed the outcome of individual battles, it had forever altered the dynamics of modern warfare. The cavalry, once dismissed as outdated and irrelevant, had proven their worth through their innovative tactics. As they continued to refine their methods of warfare, the cavalry became a force to be reckoned with, one that could no longer be ignored. Their newfound strategies, born out of necessity and creativity, began to shift the very foundations of how battles were fought. In the early stages of the war, the cavalry had faced overwhelming odds. The machine guns, tanks, and other technological advances had made the old methods of warfare seem obsolete. The cavalry, once masters of the battlefield, now found themselves outmatched at every turn. But rather than retreating into the shadows of history, they adapted. They realized that it wasn't enough to charge headlong into battle. They needed to rethink their entire approach to warfare. The cavalry's tactics evolved to embrace their greatest strength, mobility. Rather than charging in a straight line, they began to scatter, using speed and unpredictability to their advantage. They could no longer afford to face the enemy head. Instead, they used the terrain, the cover of night, and their agility to strike where the enemy least expected it. The cavalry had learned to dance around the machine guns, exploiting their weaknesses and forcing the enemy to play catch-up. One of the most important tactical changes was the cavalry's use of diversionary tactics. By splitting their forces and creating chaos, they forced the enemy to divide their attention. This not only created confusion within the enemy ranks, but also allowed the cavalry to strike at their weakest points. The machine guns, which once seemed impervious to attack, were now vulnerable to the cavalry's speed and unpredictability. It wasn't just about avoiding machine gun fire, it was about disrupting the enemy's entire strategy. The cavalry also became masters of psychological warfare. They knew that machine gun crews who had grown used to facing predictable, conventional attacks, would be thrown off balance by the cavalry's unorthodox movements. The mere sight of cavalry riding swiftly through the battlefield, appearing and disappearing without warning, created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The machine gunners, once confident in their ability to mow down any opponent, now found themselves questioning their own safety. In one particularly dramatic instance, a cavalry unit was tasked with neutralizing a heavily fortified position that had been holding up the advance of their army. The enemy, entrenched behind machine gun nests and barbed wire, believed they were invincible. The cavalry, however, had a different plan. Rather than charging directly at the fortifications, they circled around the perimeter, using the terrain to conceal their movements. They attacked from multiple angles, catching the machine gunners off guard and forcing them to retreat. What had once seemed like an impregnable position was now in disarray, all because the cavalry had refused to play by the enemy's rules. This new way of thinking about battle using speed, unpredictability, and psychological tactics began to spread through the ranks. The cavalry was no longer a group of men riding horses with swords and lances. They had transformed into an elite force, capable of outwitting their enemies through ingenuity and adaptation. The machine guns, which had once been the pinnacle of military technology, were no longer the unstoppable force they had been made out to be. The cavalry's ability to adapt to modern warfare, using a combination of old and new tactics, not only allowed them to survive it, allowed them to thrive. Their success on the battlefield was a testament to the power of innovation and the willingness to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. The cavalry had changed the rules of war, and in doing so, they had proved that sometimes the greatest weapon is not technology, but creativity and the ability to think outside the box. The cavalry's resurgence wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was the result of soldiers pushing themselves to understand the rapidly changing nature of warfare and adapting their skills to meet the challenges posed by new technologies. The cavalrymen knew they could no longer rely solely on traditional methods. The age of charging headlong into machine gun fire was over. Instead, they had to learn how to fight against technology, not just with it. This was not an easy transition. Many of the men who had once fought in the saddle, armed with swords and lances, now had to learn to operate in a world dominated by guns, tanks, and airplanes. The horse was no longer the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. It was the human ingenuity that had to be harnessed to turn the tide. One of the most important lessons the cavalry learned was how to survive in the face of modern firepower. Rather than meeting the machine guns head-on, they had to learn to use the terrain and their speed to outmaneuver the enemy. The cavalry had to be unpredictable, moving quickly, disappearing into the fog or the night, and striking from unexpected angles. They learned that being fast wasn't enough. They had to be smart. In training, cavalrymen began to focus less on traditional riding and more on tactics that would allow them to survive in the age of machine guns. They studied the enemy's tactics and learned how to exploit their weaknesses. They practiced moving in small, fast units, with each group working in sync to confuse and overwhelm the enemy. No longer could they rely on charging in a straight line. They had to become masters of mobility and surprise. The cavalry also learned the importance of technology, but not in the traditional sense. While they couldn't compete with tanks or machine guns in terms of firepower, they realized that their greatest strength lay in their ability to adapt. They began to incorporate new technologies into their strategies, using radios to communicate across vast distances, developing new forms of reconnaissance to find weak points in the enemy's defenses, and even using aircraft for aerial support. But it wasn't just about using technology. It was about learning how to fight against it. The cavalry adapted to the new reality of warfare by focusing on speed and deception. They used their mobility to get in and out of situations quickly, striking when the enemy least expected it. By studying the machine guns and understanding how they operated, the cavalry learned how to create openings in the enemy's defense that were previously thought to be impossible. One particularly striking example of this adaptation came in a battle where the cavalry was tasked with breaking through a heavily fortified position. The enemy had set up a network of machine gun nests and barbed wire, confident that their defenses were unbreakable. The cavalry, however, had learned to exploit the weaknesses of such positions. Instead of charging directly at the defenses, they used their knowledge of the enemy's tactics to flank them from the side, drawing fire away from the main force and creating an opening for a decisive strike. This ability to think on their feet, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to use technology not just as a tool but as a weapon in itself, allowed the cavalry to turn the tide in numerous battles. They became the masters of surprise and unpredictability, using their wits and their speed to outmaneuver enemies who had relied too heavily on their technology. The cavalry revolution wasn't just about horses or weapons. It was about a mindset, a way of thinking that emphasized adaptability, intelligence, and resilience. The cavalrymen had learned to fight against the very technologies that had once threatened to make them obsolete. They had shown that, in war, creativity and the ability to evolve were just as important as the weapons at your disposal. Innovation in warfare doesn't always come from the most obvious places. Sometimes it arises from the unlikely sources. Men on horseback, once thought to be obsolete, finding new ways to survive and thrive in a world dominated by advanced technology. The cavalry's battle against machine guns wasn't just about adapting to new technologies. It was about creating their own form of innovation on the battlefield. One of the most significant ways that cavalry turned a tide was through their use of combined tactics. While the machine guns were powerful, they had a major flaw. They were designed for a stationary defense. Machine gunners were trained to keep their eyes fixed on a single target, engaging whatever came into their line of sight. But the cavalry didn't move in straight lines anymore. They didn't charge directly at the enemy's position and didn't stick to predictable patterns. The cavalry had learned to keep moving, to stay fluid and fast, which made it incredibly difficult for the machine gunners to maintain an accurate defense. But this innovation went beyond just tactical movements. The cavalry had begun to experiment with blending their traditional strengths with new technologies. They started coordinating with reconnaissance units, gathering vital information about enemy positions. The cavalry's speed allowed them to cover vast amounts of terrain in short periods, feeding crucial intelligence to their commanders. They could relay this information back to the front lines, allowing their forces to adapt on the fly and set up ambushes that the machine gunners never saw coming. It wasn't just about riding into battle with a sword and a gun anymore. The cavalry was now using the tools of modern warfare alongside their traditional tactics. They began to work with infantry units, coordinating strikes where the machine guns were weak, attacking from multiple angles, and always keeping the enemy guessing. The cavalry wasn't just a support force anymore. They were becoming an integral part of a larger strategy, a force that could attack, retreat, and attack again, all while keeping the enemy in a state of constant confusion. A key moment in this battle of innovation came during a particularly brutal confrontation in the trenches. The enemy had fortified their positions, surrounding themselves with machine gun nests, and believed they were untouchable. The cavalry, however, didn't rush in. They didn't fall into the trap of charging head-on. Instead, they worked in tandem with specialized infantry units, using their speed and flexibility to draw fire from the machine gunners while the infantry moved into position. This coordinated assault was a masterclass in combined arms warfare. The cavalry lured the enemy's attention away from the vulnerable spots, making the machine gunners focus on them, while the infantry closed in from behind, using the cover of the cavalry's distractions to secure key positions. In the end, the cavalry's ability to think outside the box, to mix old and new strategies, led to a decisive victory. The machine guns were overwhelmed by the speed and unpredictability of the cavalry's tactics, and their once unshakable position was broken. The cavalry had changed the game. They had transformed from a mocked and outclassed force into a deadly instrument of war, one that combined speed, precision, and innovation in ways the machine gunners had never anticipated. What had once seemed like an outdated way of fighting had been reborn, and the cavalry's success inspired other branches of the military to rethink their own strategies. The true brilliance of the cavalry wasn't just in their survival. It was in their ability to create new ways of fighting that blended the old with the new. In doing so, they had brought innovation back into the heart of warfare, and in the process, they had become the most unexpected yet unstoppable force on the battlefield. As the war raged on, the cavalry's legacy became clear. What had once been seen as a force doomed to obsolescence had now evolved into a symbol of innovation and resilience. The cavalry's journey from being mocked and disregarded to becoming the nightmare of machine gunners wasn't just about tactics. It was about redefining what it meant to fight in the modern world. They had proved that it wasn't always the latest technology or the strongest weapon that won wars. It was the ability to adapt, to outthink, and to outmaneuver the enemy. The impact of the cavalry's newfound role in warfare was felt across the military. Their success forced commanders to rethink their strategies, blending old-school mobility with cutting-edge technology. The cavalry had shown that innovation didn't always come from the highest levels of command or the engineers who built the tanks and machine guns. It could come from the men who were willing to adapt to the changing nature of battle. It was a reminder that the true strength of any army lies in its ability to think outside the box, to embrace change, and to overcome the challenges of an ever-evolving battlefield. In the years following the war, military tacticians began to study the cavalry's methods, recognizing how their ability to adapt to new technologies had allowed them to survive and even thrive in a world where most had written them off. The cavalry's lessons were applied not only to the future of mounted warfare, but also to other areas of military strategy, particularly in the development of specialized units and unconventional tactics. The cavalry had, in essence, laid the foundation for the modern concept of combined arms warfare, where flexibility, coordination, and adaptability are the key to success. Even as the horse became less central to military operations, the cavalry's legacy lived on in the principles they had championed. Their use of speed and maneuver, their ability to strike unexpectedly, and their capacity to adapt to new challenges became lessons for future generations of soldiers. The cavalry had shown that sometimes the best way to defeat technology is to use your wits, your mobility, and your ability to innovate when the odds are stacked against you. As time passed, the world moved toward more mechanized forms of warfare, and the cavalry's role as an active fighting force gradually diminished. Tanks, aircraft, and specialized infantry units took the place of mounted soldiers on the battlefield. Yet, the lessons of the cavalry, the importance of adaptability, creativity, and innovation remained as relevant as ever. They had proven that, Even in an age dominated by machines, the human element, the ability to think, adapt, and act decisively was still the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. Today, the cavalry's legacy continues to influence military strategies worldwide. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of creativity in the face of adversity. The cavalry had risen from the ashes of ridicule, adapting to the changing landscape of warfare and ultimately leaving behind a legacy that would inspire future generations. They had proven that no force is ever truly obsolete as long as there are soldiers willing to innovate, adapt, and rise to the challenge. As we reflect on the cavalry's journey, it becomes clear that their story is not just one of survival, it's one of transformation. They had been written off, underestimated, and ridiculed, but in the end, they changed the course of history. The cavalry had shown that the true strength of any army lies not in its weapons, but in its ability to adapt to new challenges, to innovate, and to outthink the enemy. If this story of the cavalry's legacy inspired you, be sure to leave a comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe for more untold stories from history. What do you think about the cavalry's impact on modern warfare? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Don't forget to check out the next video that's appearing on your screen now.